I think this man has one of the most magnetic personalities in London. Of course, this isn't a real man. It's a painting by Giovanni Bellini of the Doge Leonardo Loredan, who was elected ruler of Venice in 1501. But even though I know that this is a piece of wood with paint on it, hanging on a wall in the National Gallery, I can't help feeling that I'm somehow in the presence of an actual person. This portrait communicates ideas and information about this man so strongly that they're still effective 500 years after it was made. The different halves of his face seem to project contrasting but complementary sides to his personality. Strong and steely, but also thoughtful, showing, perhaps with a calculated modesty, his awareness of his limitations as a mortal man. This was an important factor in the portrait of a new Doge, who was elected to his powerful post in Venice's Grand Ducal Palace for the duration of his lifetime only. The job could not be handed on to his son. I think I have the sense that Loredan is almost here in the room with me, partly because he's right at the front of the picture, and there's nothing in the luminous blue background to distract my attention. What really makes him seem present, though, is the extraordinary realism of this painting. His face looks three-dimensional, as light bathes him from the left and shadows form to the right. I can imagine what his skin would feel like. I can sense the weight and texture of his damask cape, from the way that the artist has created an illusion of soft sheen and heavy folds. This is another painting made in Italy at the same time, in the first few years of the 16th century. It's known as the Virgin of the Rocks because of this elaborate cave-like setting in which the infant St. John is blessed by the Christ child, watched over by the Virgin Mary and an angel. It was painted by Leonardo da Vinci and his workshop for a chapel in Milan. Like Bellini's portrait of Doge Loredan, this has also been painted with a high degree of naturalism. Leonardo spent hours studying plants and rocks and exploring the ways in which three-dimensional figures relate to the space around them. He and his assistants have skillfully represented all of these elements in paint on a flat surface. This picture also seems to radiate a tremendous sense of calm. Perhaps this is because of the serenity of these four faces. It could also be because the figures are arranged in such a balanced, stable composition, centred around this eloquent, protective hand gesture. So, these are two powerful paintings, both of which display sophisticated uses of naturalistic painting techniques. But they look very different from one another. Bellini's glittering, hard-edged figure is nothing like the forms that emerge from Leonardo's smoky shadows. The paintings were made at the same time, but in different Italian city-states for quite different purposes. One a secular power portrait, the other a work for religious meditation. Together, however, they hint at the astonishing quality and variety of artistic achievement in Italy in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Paintings from this period were particularly valued by the 19th century founders of the National Gallery in London, so it's an ideal starting place for an exploration of the later years of what's known as the Italian Renaissance. This French word means rebirth, and it's been used to describe a period of several hundred years of cultural transformation across Europe. In the early years, from the late 13th to the early 15th centuries, Italian painting changed dramatically. At the start of this period, nearly all art was religious. Key figures were depicted in highly stylised ways that deliberately didn't relate to reality. This was meant to be a heavenly world that stood apart from our own. By the middle of the 15th century, paintings looked very different indeed. In response to changing demands from church patrons, and stimulated by the rediscovery and discussion of artefacts and ideas from classical antiquity, generations of artists had begun to develop ways of painting more naturalistically. They started to observe the human body directly, representing movements and expressions that made each figure's actions and reactions seem more believable. Increasingly, people in paintings appeared to inhabit three-dimensional spaces. In this work from the 1450s, Piero della Francesca has included realistic details of people undressing ready for the ritual of baptism. Christ is being baptized by St. John in the foreground. Piero has also used linear perspective to create the illusion of the landscape receding into the distance. As his trees become smaller, following lines that meet at a vanishing point, so we are convinced by the optical illusion that the smallest trees are the furthest away. But of course, these moves were just the beginning. The great painters of the later Italian Renaissance in Florence, Rome and here in Venice, painters like Leonardo da Vinci, Giovanni Bellini, Botticelli, Raphael and Michelangelo, would go on to perfect these naturalistic strategies, apply them in all sorts of different ways, and indeed would move beyond them. The kinds of painting that were produced would also change radically, as it became increasingly acceptable for art to feature non-religious subject matter. If we go back to the 1450s, we can see that at this point, artists were engaged with developing naturalism in their work. Fra Filippo Lippi was one of many artist monks working in Italy. He painted this panel showing the Annunciation in the early 1450s. It may have been a decoration for a bedchamber. This is perhaps why the panel is curved like this at the top. A youthful Archangel Gabriel respectfully keeps his distance from the Virgin Mary as he brings news that she is to bear the Son of God. As if to emphasise the point, the hand of God appears above her, and a dove, representing the Holy Spirit, spirals down towards the Virgin's womb. Tiny golden rays of light shine out from her body. Mary's purity is represented by a symbolic setting and particular flowers. She sits cloistered within an architectural framework that creates a boundary around her and which is itself inside another enclosed space, her walled garden, symbol of her untouched womb. The perfect white lilies that grow in the urn before her are another sign of Mary's purity. Gabriel has brought another stem as an offering. Lippi has gone to great lengths to make the different elements of this painting look real. We see not just carefully observed flowers, but also peacock feathers, folds of cloth, and attempts at three-dimensional architectural elements. This carving on the low parapet shows 3 feathers within a ring. It was a device used by the powerful Florentine Medici family, who perhaps commissioned this panel along with a companion piece that shows some of the family's main name saints. The Medici helped Lippi at a particularly difficult time in his life. He seems to have found it impossible to keep his monastic vows and had a relationship with a nun. The Medici helped obtain special dispensation for them to marry, and the couple had a son, Filippino. He too would become an artist. This is the central panel from one of Filippino's altarpieces, which dates from about 1485. There's even more naturalism than we saw in his father's painting. Here, the Virgin and Child are attended by a muscular St. Jerome, shown holding the rock he used to beat his chest as he prayed. He's joined by a contemplative St. Dominic, who holds symbolic lilies and meditates on a religious text. These figures are positioned within a wonderful landscape, full of detail and incident. Beneath the craggy rocks at the left, we can just make out the tiny figure of St. Jerome praying before a crucifix. His faithful companion, the lion, defends Jerome's cave from an attacking bear. His faith and courage are being rewarded with protection. On the lush green hillside at the right, we see people receiving medicines from a dispensary. This altarpiece was made for a chapel in the church of San Pancrazio in Florence, to which a hospital was attached. This might explain the inclusion of this particular building. The landscape, with its carefully observed rocks and leaves, adds to the sense of realism here, although the figures don't quite sit convincingly within their setting. They seem rather superimposed on top of it. The makers of this panel, which shows the martyrdom of St. Sebastian, also struggled to situate their figures comfortably within a landscape and to relate the foreground of the painting with the middle and backgrounds. Although this landscape is a phenomenal achievement, it manages to sweep our eyes back through miles of countryside that looks very much like the Arno Valley outside Florence. It was painted by two brothers, Antonio and Piero del Palaiuolo. They sometimes worked separately and at other times collaborated, bringing together their different skills, as indeed did many artists working at this time. Artists rarely worked alone. Most were part of a studio that brought together a master, pupils and associate artists who would work together on a wide variety of projects, including metalwork, stained glass, sculpture, as well as painting. Antonio was particularly interested in the human form. You can tell that from the figures of the executioners who fire their arrows into Sebastian. This foreground group has been arranged with great symmetry, and we can see that the artist has shown us the same pose from different angles. He's also painted both clothed and unclothed versions of these men, showing off the tensed muscles and ligaments of the archers as they reload their crossbows. As part of his prolonged scrutiny of the human form, Antonio made small dynamic sculptures of figures in movement. He also produced engravings of fighting men that became celebrated reference points for other artists. Their muscles aren't exactly right. He probably didn't dissect corpses as Leonardo would later do. However, the results are still very impressive. Piero was less skilled at painting realistic bodies. He may well have been the brother responsible for the figure of St. Sebastian here, which isn't quite so convincing as those of his tormentors. Piero was, however, a skilled painter of faces. Stoically turned towards heaven, Sebastian's face was apparently recognised as the portrait of a handsome local nobleman when the altarpiece was unveiled in 1475 in the oratory of St. Sebastian attached to the Annunziata church in Florence. Religious processions often involved real youths playing the parts of martyred saints, so making a reference to a real Florentine in a painting like this wasn't actually as strange an idea as it might seem to us now. If this really does show a local youth, it would have been rather an honour for him. Florence in the 1470s was a particularly vibrant artistic centre. This panel is just one of many paintings and sculptures to come out of the busy studio of Andrea del Verrocchio, who had trained with the famous naturalistic sculptor Donatello. We see a young man, Tobias, linking arms in a delicate gesture with the figure that he doesn't yet realise is his guardian angel. Tobias is on a mission to collect a debt on behalf of his blind father. The angel has helped him not only to escape from an attack by a large fish, but has persuaded him to harvest organs from the fish, stored for now in this little box, which Tobias will later use to cure his father's blindness and to rid his own future wife of demons. The fish doesn't look so threatening in this representation of the story, perhaps because it's so clearly based on a real fish that one of Verrocchio's young assistants must have purchased at the market. It's wonderfully observed, from the silvery scales to the thin red line along its belly that shows it has been gutted. The naturalism doesn't extend to the way that the figures have been arranged, but we sense that this is not necessarily because of a lack of skill on the part of Verrocchio and his studio. Instead, artist and patron have preferred the decorative flourishes made possible by positioning these two young men in an elaborate kind of dance, their fashionable Florentine clothes swirling out in gorgeous colourful shapes around them. Another artist who was vying for attention within the crowded Florentine market was Sandro Botticelli. In this tondo, or circular painting made by Botticelli in the early 1470s, the artist has sought to dazzle his customers, and no doubt his own professional peers, with a bravura display of linear perspective. The ruined classical architecture that serves as the stable in which Christ was born has a symbolic function. It represents the end of the old order, the crumbling stonework, and the beginning of the new Christian era. The building also, though, marks out lines that connect directly to the viewer's space. The Virgin and Child receive visitors in the centre of the painting, and we seem to be part of the queue of kings and other dignitaries who approach to pay homage. We're next, right after this horse. This young man in blue also links to the viewer, looking us straight in the eye. When you get up close to this painting, you really do feel as if you're part of the jostling crowd, which is full of people gossiping, staring, struggling to keep control of their animals, or even becoming bored as they wait their turn. This lively, innovative painting was made early in Botticelli's career. He would become extremely successful, operating a large studio in Florence. This mystic nativity was painted 25 years later, and we might be surprised to see that it's actually a lot less realistic than the tondo. Elements like the rocky path and the cave that is part of the stable are shown in obviously stylised ways. The figures of Mary and the Christ child are larger than the kings and shepherds who have come to worship them. This is a reference back to medieval traditions, when the most important figures in a painting or sculpture were given the greatest size, with no interest in creating a realistic sense of scale. This also reminds us that the quest for ever greater naturalism didn't always win over other ideas and interests. Angels embrace mortals in pairs at the front, as little devils scurry away into crevices in the landscape, unable to bear so much love and goodness. More angels dance in a circle as they fly up to heaven, carrying scrolls upon which are written prayers from people on earth. A text in Greek at the top of this painting refers to Italy's troubles and to apocalyptic imagery. It's why this is called a mystic nativity, where this scene is shown as having the mystical power to redeem mankind. Indeed, many Florentines felt that they needed to pray hard for salvation in 1500, after recent military invasions by the French and outbreaks of plague. Botticelli was one of many who had listened avidly to the monk Savonarola's evocations of hellfire and vivid calls for repentance and the renunciation of a life of luxury and sin. There were stories that Botticelli destroyed some of his own earlier work, believing it to have been immoral. Certainly there are some surviving paintings that we can imagine would not have met with Savonarola's approval. Chief among these are some of his mythological paintings. As the numbers of wealthy, powerful citizens grew, so did the demand for pictures of non-religious subject matter. The rediscovery of material from classical antiquity provided a wide range of exciting stories from Greco-Roman mythology, and artists eagerly began to depict them. This panel shows the goddess of love, Venus, with her exhausted lover, Mars, the god of war. Their tangled draperies and Mars's undressed state make it clear that this adulterous pair have recently made love. Mars is now so fast asleep that even these mischievous little satyrs cannot wake him by playing with his armour and blowing a conch shell in his ear. Venus looks on from the other side of the panel, perhaps annoyed that her lover is quite so sound asleep. She also, though, seems to be quite aware of her power in this situation. She has disarmed the god of war, rendering him unconscious and vulnerable. The long, thin shape of this panel suggests that it originally decorated a spalliera, the backboard of a bench or chest. It was probably part of a set of painted furniture panels given as a wedding gift, perhaps to recently married members of the Vespucci family. Their name might be the reason for the inclusion of these wasps, vespe in Italian. It would be a light-hearted way of referring to the Vespucci. Such a panel was meant to be fun. There were all sorts of lewd references to male postcoital exhaustion in poems and plays at the time. It may also, though, have intended to hint at more complex moral issues about gender and the necessary balance within a marriage between male and female attributes. Botticelli has certainly used his naturalistic painting skills here. Look at the foreshortened face of Mars, for example. He has also given a great deal of attention to patterning and design. Much of Venus's sensuality comes from the shapes made by her elaborate hairstyle and by the braiding and complex folds of her dress. This facility perhaps came from the time Botticelli spent working as a goldsmith. The skills and interests developed in one medium would often influence the way that an artist then worked with another kind of material. The illusion he creates here is one of a solid, beautifully draped three-dimensional couple, although there are some oddities. Where, for example, is Venus's right leg? Mythological subjects like the lives and loves of the gods and goddesses became increasingly popular as subject matter for painted cassone chests and their backboards. We're not always sure now of precisely which subject is being represented. This spalliera panel by Piero di Cosimo, painted in about 1495, shows a satyr, half man, half goat, apparently mourning over a dead nymph. We can see that she's received a serious wound to her throat. It might be related to the story of Cephalus and Procris. According to the classical author Ovid, Procris suspected her husband of adultery and spied on him while he was resting after the hunt. He heard her make a noise and threw his spear in her direction, thinking she was an animal. Procris sadly died from her injuries. This subject was often used for wedding gifts in particular, as it could be seen as a warning against wifely jealousy. An air of melancholy hangs over the scene, underlined by the mournful dog whose curved back echoes the form of the satyr at the other side. Piero di Cosimo painted an even more tragic scene for another spalliera decoration. This panel, made in about 1500, shows the fight between the Lapiths and drunken centaurs, who gate-crashed the wedding feast of the Lapith king. It's quite a disturbing painting when you get up close, perhaps because Piero's naturalism is applied to some quite violent subject matter. The painting is full of vicious fighting and lustful groping. In the foreground, the artist places a contrasting scene of quiet tragedy. The female centaur Iolonome kisses her lover Silarus as he dies from a javelin wound. Perhaps this is a reminder that pure, noble love is possible, even in a world where everyone else seems to have lost control. Love, chastity, power, restraint. These are all themes that were increasingly explored in decorative panels intended for grand Florentine rooms in the latter part of the 15th century. We see Daphne just managing to escape the amorous clutches of the god Apollo in this panel by Antonio Palaiuolo from the 1470s. She keeps her honour by transforming into a tree. Here, love is doing battle with chastity. A beautiful maiden in a white dress, she repels Cupid's arrows with a steely resolve. The artist who painted this small panel, Gherardo di Giovanni del Fiora, was referring to a work by the celebrated 14th century poet Petrarch. His writing explored ideal Platonic love and moral triumph as part of a broader discussion of philosophical and spiritual ideas. Luca Signorelli has referred to the same subject matter in this fresco, painted plaster which has been carefully sliced off the wall that it originally decorated and attached to canvas. Here we see love disarmed and bound by Petrarch's ideal woman, Laura, helped by chaste heroines from antiquity. Other new subject matter was also increasingly depicted during this period. Portraiture emerged as an independent category of Italian art during the second half of the 15th century. Rather than only showing patrons as small portraits included on the margins of religious works as a sign of their devotion, it became acceptable for them to be painted in their own right, as independent figures. Early portraits used the profile form that for centuries had represented the heads of powerful men on coins and medals. This is Giovanni da Oriolo's painted portrait of Leonella d'Este, made in about 1447. We can see how similar it is in format to this cast bronze medal made by Pisanello in 1444 to celebrate Leonella's marriage. The profile portrait was also used for women, although the connotations of authority and power rarely seem to have been generated by paintings of female subjects. Alesso Baldovinetti painted this portrait of a lady in about 1465. He has emphasised her long neck and high forehead, both signs of beauty in northern Italian culture, along with her golden hair, which has been wound into an elaborate style with just a few locks left to hang freely. Baldovinetti has used the handle of his brush to score in lines to represent this hair so that it seems almost to be made of spun gold. We get some idea of this woman's facial features through the shape of her nose and chin, but the profile format means that we don't see enough of her face to get a real sense of what she looks like, or what she might be like as an individual. She cannot make eye contact with us. That would have been an immodest action for a young woman of her class. Instead, she seems almost pinned like a butterfly in the frame, turned so that a great deal of emphasis is placed on the emblem embroidered on her sleeve. This is almost certainly a reference to her husband's family. Portraits of women were usually made at the time of marriage, and they were shown in new clothes that displayed their allegiance to the family to which they now belonged. There hasn't yet been a convincing suggestion for exactly who this woman might be and into which family she might have married. The profile portrait began to be surpassed in the latter part of the 15th century by other formats that gave scope to represent more of the sitter's features and which allowed him to make eye contact with the viewer. I say him for a reason. In Florence, certainly, the profile format was retained for women for years after men began to be shown from the more mobile, expressive three-quarter face angle. Women from the Florentine upper classes led a highly restricted life, and it seems that portraiture both reflected and perpetuated this confinement. In this portrait from about 1475, the Sicilian artist Antonello da Messina shows us a three-quarter view of a young man. It seems particularly powerful and present, not just because of its naturalism, but also because he looks straight out at us. We know from X-radiographs that Antonello experimented with the eyes of his sitter and originally had them looking off to the side. In this work he was almost certainly referring to Northern European portraits, which developed into more sophisticated formats long before those produced in Italy. This is a portrait by the Netherlandish artist Jan van Eyck, made in 1433, some 40 years before Antonello's painting. It may be a self-portrait. It's certainly a painting that uses the powerful tool of direct eye contact with the sitter. Van Eyck made some celebrated portraits in the early 15th century, some of which are in the National Gallery. This painting from 1434 is known as the Arnolfini portrait because we think that it shows an Italian merchant who had settled in Bruges, Giovanni Arnolfini, here with his wife. It's a highly sophisticated work that uses an interior setting, a fictionalised representation of a room in the Arnolfini house, to tell us just how wealthy and pious this couple are. The luxurious carpet and casually strewn expensive oranges tell us as much about this couple's status as their clothes made of fur and armfuls of fabric. That's why Mrs. Arnolfini looks as if she might be pregnant. This ostentatious style of dress uses metres of expensive cloth as a way of showing off. There are also, though, religious carvings and decorations on items like the bench and mirror, which remind us that these people are God-fearing as well as rich. Every detail is rendered with minute exactitude. Working in the Netherlands, Van Eyck had the benefit of a paint technology that in the 1430s was not yet widely used in Italy: oil paint. Because it takes much longer for oil to dry than the egg yolk traditionally used for mixing colours in tempera paint, the substances that most panel painters in Italy used, artists had time to blend colours together so that they looked much more like the surfaces of real objects. Oil paint, as well as innovative portraiture formats, would travel to northern Italy during the 15th century. Artists would move, and small panel paintings were highly portable, so there was a good deal of cross-fertilisation between northern and southern continental painting practices. In this portrait of a young man from the early 1480s, Botticelli has used both egg tempera and oil paint to represent his subject's features. He's also made the bold move of turning the youth to face us almost head-on, although he doesn't quite make eye contact. It's interesting just how much more of his face we see from this angle. I'm really struck by the determined set of his mouth and the firm line of his brow. If I want to, I can start to imagine what kind of person he might have been, or at least the idea that he's chosen to present of himself here. Serious, mature despite his evident youth. This is a form of portraiture that offers many more possibilities than the profile view. While Florence, Botticelli's main base, was undoubtedly an important artistic centre, other Italian city-states were also highly productive. Italy was not the unified country that it is now, and each city-state had a ruler and influential citizens, many of whom wanted to buy art for their palaces and local churches. Religious orders, too, remained important patrons of the visual arts. Painting in these different areas often developed a particular flavour or style that was obviously to the taste of the local ruler and his court. This panel by Cosimo Tura, showing the Virgin and Child enthroned and serenaded by musical angels, was part of an altarpiece that the artist made for a church in Ferrara in the mid-1470s. Tura was court painter for the ruling Este family, although here he was working for another local family whose power was on the rise, the Roverellas. Early accounts of the painting when it was placed in the church suggest that a panel to the bottom left showed a member of the Roverella family who had recently died, knocking on a door leading to the National Gallery's panel. He appeared to be asking to be let into heaven. These reports are supported by the fragments of an inscription on the portative organ that you can still see. The words bid the Christ child to rise and let Roverella in. This must have been a bold and unusual move on the part of the artist and the patron. But then, this is quite an unusual painting overall. Turra's love of elaborate architectural detail, contrasting colours, and very individual approach to painting folds of cloth are unlike the work of other Italian artists. His individual style was, though, clearly popular in Ferrara. Carlo Crivelli was another late 15th century painter whose work was filled with elaborate patterns and decorative forms, although mixed in with wonderful evidence of observation. Look at this little girl peering round a wall, or at the plants and luxurious carpet decorating this loggia. Crivelli worked in the Marches, having been forced to leave his hometown of Venice after an adulterous affair came to light. He developed a highly idiosyncratic style, as we can see in this Annunciation scene with St. Emilius from 1482. The Virgin occupies her usual enclosed space, but this time it's an elaborate palace that has a handily placed opening through which a ray of heavenly light and the Holy Spirit can enter. Outside in the street, the Archangel Gabriel has been engaged in conversation by a local saint, Emidius. He's holding a model of the town for which this altarpiece was made, Ascoli Piceno. It almost looks like he's lobbying Gabriel for special favours for his town. And in fact, those favours have already been granted. Crivelli has made dramatic use of linear perspective to transport the viewer towards the back of the painting, where this section of wall has been so realistically repaired with dribbling mortar. On the way, we encounter people who are going about their business, oblivious to the momentous events taking place at our end of the street. We also meet others who look up, astonished at the light coming down from the sky. When we follow their gaze, we encounter these two figures on the bridge. A carrier pigeon has arrived, bringing news that the town of Ascoli Piceno has been awarded some limited but important rights of self-government. So all St. Emidius's work, and indeed the prayers of the townsfolk, have paid off. This altarpiece was commissioned as a celebration of the dual annunciation that we see here, Mary's news and the town's own discovery of its new life. The inscription at the bottom celebrates Libertas Ecclesiastica, their freedom. Crivelli has also included here his trademark fruits, painted so naturalistically that it looks as if you could pick them up and eat them. They might have had some symbolic significance, but it's perhaps more likely that they were Crivelli's finishing flourish to show off his extraordinary skill. Crivelli was inspired in part by the work of this artist, Andrea Mantegna, who painted initially in Padua and then moved to the court at Mantua. In this example, The Agony in the Garden, painted in about 1460, we can see the same dribbling mortar and detailed architectural work that Crivelli would emulate 25 years later in his Annunciation scene. This walled city represents Jerusalem, although Mantegna has clearly looked at some ancient Roman monuments to help with his design. There's a building that looks very much like the Colosseum. Mantegna was fascinated by antiquity and looked at both architecture and sculpture from the classical age as he developed his approach to painting. Christ has left the city to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane. The 3 disciples that he asked to sit and pray with him all night have fallen asleep, so he is effectively alone when he sees a vision of angels holding the instruments that will be used to torture him. In the middle ground, Judas is leading Roman soldiers towards the garden, so we know that Christ's arrest is imminent. Mantegna has studied sleeping figures closely. You can almost hear the snores of this trio. He's also scrutinised animal and plant life. Less realistic are the strata of the rocks and the folds of fabric draped over his figures. These are probably inspired more by sculpted representations of fabric than by real cloth. Mantegna was so interested in classical sculpture that he made some paintings that deliberately emulated the effect of carved stone. Here he shows the religious cult of Cybele being introduced to the ancient Romans. It looks like a relief sculpture, with the monochrome foreground painted in tones of grey against a coloured, mottled background that has the appearance of one of the semi-precious stones often used in this kind of sculpture. Mantegna was an influential artist, not least because he was related by marriage to an important Venetian artistic dynasty, the Bellini family. His wife was the sister of Giovanni Bellini, the painter of Doge Leonardo Loredan. Bellini also painted the subject of The Agony in the Garden, about 5 years after Mantegna. There are some clear visual links between the two works, like the strange sloping rock formations and the winding paths that lead our eyes backwards. Both paintings also show at least one sleeping disciple with a sharply foreshortened face. Perhaps Bellini intended to pay homage to his brother-in-law, who was a celebrated artist. There are, though, elements here that are all Bellini's own, for example the depiction of the sunrise. He manages to capture the effect of the sunlight just touching the undersides of the clouds as it emerges. It's a fantastic piece of naturalistic painting. Bellini's vision of the angel bearing the chalice that will hold Christ's blood is very different from the group of stocky cherubs who press forwards towards Mantegna's Christ. Bellini's angel is ethereal, transparent. He looks almost as if he's made from Venetian glass. Venice was another very particular context within which art was made. It's a city that is full of reflected light because of these pale green luminous canals. There was a long tradition of Venetian artists responding to the light that surrounded them, as well as using the materials that were in abundance in their city, not just glass, but the finest paint pigments available, which were imported directly into the city. The position of Venice on the northeastern side of the Italian peninsula meant that the city was the main trading post with countries to the east. Ultramarine blue arrived here as lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Its name reflects the long journey that brought it to Italy. Ultramarine means over the seas. Of course, people, as well as goods, moved between Venice and eastern power bases like Constantinople. Gentile Bellini, Giovanni's brother, worked here as a court artist for the Turkish Sultan Mehmet II in the late 15th century, painting this portrait of the Sultan while he was there. The same dramatic, dark background is used in Gentile's portrait of Cardinal Bessarion and two members of the Scuola della Carità praying to the Bessarion reliquary. This was a precious object that held wooden fragments believed to be from the cross on which Christ was crucified. The Greek Cardinal Bessarion presented it in 1472 to the Scuola, a confraternity or group of devoted civilians who did charity work. This portrait of him with the reliquary was made at the same time, and it seems to have served as the door to the cupboard in which the reliquary itself was kept. You can still see keyholes cut into the right-hand side of the panel. Gentile and Giovanni Bellini continued a thriving practice that had been established by their father, Jacopo, and their family studio became the most important art producer and training ground for new painters in Venice. Their biggest area of output was the same as many Italian studios, representations of the Madonna and Child, made on a domestic scale so that wealthy people could pray in their own homes, as well as demonstrate their piety to visitors. Gentile produced elaborate, decorative images of the Virgin and Child, which often look as if they're representations of smooth, painted sculptures. Giovanni included more naturalism in his work, as we see in his Madonna of the Meadow, made around 1500 to 1505. Here, the Virgin prays over her sleeping child as he lies in her lap. Viewers would have been familiar with the tradition for painting a similar scene that dated from some 30 years later in the Christian story, when Mary cradled the body of her dead son after it had been taken down from the cross. As she holds her baby on her lap in a similar way here, this painting evokes ideas of the fate that awaits this child. But of course, his death is also a new beginning, and new life is suggested in Bellini's painting by the landscape in which the Madonna sits, showing her humility by placing herself directly on the ground rather than on a chair or cushion. On the left we see signs of laziness and death, a resting worker, an attacking snake, leafless trees and an ominous black raven. To the right of Christ, however, the landscape is productive. Properly managed by hard-working monks, it sustains farm animals, leafy trees, and indeed supports the idealised city behind. The luminous blue of the sky is broken by more of Bellini's naturalistic clouds, and a delicate golden light bathes the scene. It's similar to the light that we saw in the portrait of Doge Leonardo Loredan, which was made at the same time as the Madonna of the Meadow. Bellini was one of the big names of the later Renaissance in Italy. Giovanni seems to have been content to stay here in Venice, dominating the art scene and training many painters who would both work in the city and establish themselves further afield. One of his pupils was the young Titian, who would go on to revolutionise Venetian painting and would sell his work to collectors across Europe for much of the 16th century, although that's another story. But just at the turn of the century, there were several other big-name artists operating in Italy, moving around and often, it seems, working in direct competition with one another. Leonardo, Michelangelo and Raphael, these were the great Renaissance rivals. Leonardo was the eldest, born in Vinci in Tuscany in 1452 and trained in the Florentine workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio. If we look again at the painting of Tobias and the Angel that Verrocchio's workshop produced in the early 1470s, we might see some work by the young Leonardo himself. It's been suggested that the silky fur of this dog might have been painted by Leonardo. It looks very much like the way that he painted hair and fur. The dog has become transparent as the paint has changed over the centuries, but he's still a wonderful addition to the scene. Leonardo really seems to have tried to explore the world, to understand it, through his visual experience. This, of course, affected his artistic production, which is full of evidence of a scientific scrutiny of the natural world, represented through increasingly skillful drawing and painting. But it also meant that he became interested in many other fields of study. As the illegitimate son of a wealthy lawyer, he didn't receive a formal classical education. Instead, he taught himself by reading, writing, drawing and making models, though his insatiable curiosity seems often to have prevented him from finishing projects, even once he'd been paid for them. The National Gallery's Virgin of the Rocks was produced to satisfy exasperated clients who'd waited years for their painting. The Milanese Confraternity of the Immaculate Conception ordered an altarpiece from Leonardo and two associates, the Predis brothers, in 1483. A painting was made relatively quickly, but the artists asked for more money as it had required a great deal of work. When this was not forthcoming, it seems that they sold their panel on the open market. It ended up in France and is now in the Louvre Museum. The confraternity then had to wait 25 years for the dispute to be resolved and a replacement panel, the National Gallery's painting, to be produced. Recent infrared reflectography has shown underdrawing of an earlier design beneath the final paint layers of the Virgin of the Rocks. It seems that there was an alternative plan to show the Virgin adoring her child in quite a different composition. You can see the shape of one of her hands beneath the area that is now covered by her face. So many years after the first painting, Leonardo might have wanted to try out some different ideas for the replacement panel. Perhaps the confraternity objected, wanting what they thought they'd paid for in the first place. Alternatively, Leonardo might have decided that since he and the Predis brothers really did have to finish this painting, it would be quicker and easier just to rework the initial design, so he abandoned his new composition. The end result is still stunning. The Madonna forms a pyramid with St. John and the Angel, a shape that centres the whole painting on solid foundations. The design is balanced without being too obviously symmetrical, and the faces of these holy figures shine out from the mysterious shadows in the background. The landscape that we can see through the mouth of the cave at the left fades from bright green to icy blue, an example of aerial perspective, one of the techniques that Leonardo developed, using colour and tone to suggest distance instead of simply relying on lines that converge in a vanishing point. This large drawing by Leonardo shows another of the techniques for which he was famous, sfumato, an Italian word that describes the smoky, misty quality we can see here. The soft shadows add to the air of mystery that surrounds this composition of the Virgin and Child, with two other figures that we think are St. Anne, the Virgin's mother, and St. John the Baptist. Several parts of this design are ambiguous. Is the Virgin sitting partly on St. Anne? It's not really clear, but the positioning of the two figures seems nevertheless to work, and we get a strong sense of their closeness. We can't really see where the Christ child's legs are, yet this smudged area works visually to suggest that he really is coming out of the Virgin Mary, as an extension of her body. This drawing was probably part of a project for an altarpiece which Leonardo never finished. We know that it wasn't used as a template for transferring the design to a panel. It would have had holes pricked in it along the major lines if it had been used in this way, so that charcoal powder could be pushed through the tiny holes, transferring the outlines. Leonardo did sometimes exhibit relatively finished drawings like this. He put a similar one on show in Florence in 1501, when he was back in the city after time spent in Milan. It achieved the desired effect of getting everyone talking about him once again. Then, as now, successful artists were often self-publicists. Leonardo's work looks very different indeed from that of the rising star of the next generation in Florence, Michelangelo Buonarroti. You can tell from his paintings that Michelangelo was first and foremost a sculptor. This early work by him is unfinished, and we can see from the way that he's blocked in the basic shapes of the two angels next to the Virgin Mary that he's thinking primarily in terms of sculptural form. He's feeling his way around solid shapes and is also focusing on negative space, the gaps between different forms. This devotional painting shows the Virgin Mary reading, with the Christ child and angels all craning to get a look at the text in her hand, so there's a sense of movement and energy that's nothing like the serenity of Leonardo's paintings. The infant St. John twists his body so that he can both point to Christ and look out at us, his serious expression a reminder of Christ's future sacrifice. The sense of uneasy dynamism that is created by bodies that are twisted or held in tension became a major feature of Michelangelo's work. We see it again in his painting of the entombment of Christ, begun around 1500 or 1501 and again left unfinished. Originally from the Tuscan hills, Michelangelo worked in several major Italian cities, sometimes summoned to Rome by the Pope for years at a time to execute key projects. These would eventually include the redecoration of the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican, where the powerful muscular bodies we see in the National Gallery paintings would really come into their own. When he started this panel, Michelangelo was working in Rome. He accepted a commission to make an altarpiece for a funerary chapel in the church of Sant'Agostino. The entombment of Christ would of course have been a fitting subject for such a location. Christ's naked body looks like a piece of polished marble sculpture. Michelangelo said that stone was his preferred medium, and later in life he certainly resented having to work in paint just because important patrons demanded it. Here he has again approached parts of his painting as if he were making a sculpture. The pale shape at the top right is the entrance to Christ's tomb. But Michelangelo hasn't painted this on top of the rocky hillside into which the tomb is set. Instead, he's removed the brown paint of the rocks, scraping and chipping away at it as if the painted panel is a piece of stone that he's carving. Michelangelo's experience as a sculptor also perhaps informs the way that this work explores ideas of weight and weightlessness, solidity and ethereality. Christ's body looks very real, and holding him is causing significant tension within the bodies of St. John the Evangelist, in red, and a female bearer, perhaps one of the three women named Mary who were at Christ's burial. At the same time, however, he appears to float above the ground. Perhaps this effect would have been changed if the painting had been finished. It might, though, have been a deliberate way of indicating that Christ will be resurrected, leaving his earthly body behind to rise to heaven. The artist seems to have left the painting unfinished when he was called away to Florence. Often, artists moved from city to city either in search of work or because they'd been asked to do a project for a particularly important patron. Sometimes these buyers deliberately exploited the rivalries that emerged between different artists. The Florentine civic authorities certainly did this with Leonardo and Michelangelo. They commissioned both artists to paint decorations of battle scenes on different walls of their new council hall, hoping that by placing these two artists in direct competition, they would spur them on to producing something really extraordinary. Studies for the frescoes and copies made after the unfinished works in progress suggest that this was a strategy that worked. They are scenes of extraordinary vigour. In the event, neither artist finished their wall, perhaps tiring of the games being played around them, although there was little love lost between them personally. Many artists were only too happy to undercut one another and steal a commission away from a competitor. The advantage often went to the artist who was most prepared to play the role of courtier if necessary, something that Michelangelo hated. The painter of this panel, however, was quite happy to dress in fine clothes and flatter his clients if it would secure a commission. This was Raphael. Raffaello Santi in Italian, so beloved by later British collectors that they developed an anglicised version of his name. He entered the artistic arena of the Renaissance rivals a little later than Leonardo and Michelangelo, but proved a formidable opponent during his short yet highly productive life. This crucifixion was painted early in his career, and it shows the influence of an artist with whom he'd worked and probably trained, Perugino. These 3 panels from an altarpiece made by Perugino for a Carthusian monastery in Pavia show the colour range of gorgeous pinks and blues that this artist often used, as well as his trademark sweet faces, each with rosebud lips. Actually, you can see that everyone, from the Virgin Mary to the warrior St. Michael, has got the same face. This repetition turned out to be a problem for Perugino. The popularity of what was for him an ideal of beauty didn't last as far as his patrons were concerned. They felt that he was recycling old ideas, sometimes as here within the same painting. Perugino found it increasingly hard to keep up with the times, complaining bitterly that he didn't understand why his patrons had liked his art before and now seemingly wanted something different. Raphael, however, was young and ambitious and only too happy to adapt what he'd learned from Perugino into an evolving personal style. He also eagerly absorbed what lessons he could from studying paintings and sculptures by Leonardo and Michelangelo, as well as the great works from classical antiquity that he saw in Florence and Rome. This painting of St. Catherine of Alexandria, shown with a wheel to represent the way that she was tortured for her Christian faith, seems to echo both artists. The serenity of her face and that gesture of her hand across her breast is reminiscent of Leonardo's paintings. But the twist in her body and the energy that it gives to the composition hints more at Michelangelo, although Raphael has made the movement into something far less edgy, an image that seems instead to invite calm contemplation. I find that I'm gripped by paintings by both Michelangelo and Raphael, but for completely different reasons. I find Michelangelo strange and exciting, a bit unnerving sometimes, but it's hard to look away from his extraordinary muscled, androgynous figures. When I look at a work by Raphael, such as the Madonna of the Pinks, it tends instead to calm me, so that I stand still and look for a long time in quite a focused way. It's not that the Raphael is any less complex, but it's deliberately smooth, polished, and aiming to evoke a sense of harmony and intimacy that's quite different from Michelangelo's more dramatic approach. This is an even more highly developed example of Raphael's combination of lively movement with a serenity that seems to extend out to envelop the viewer. This panel shows the Madonna and Child with the infant St. John the Baptist. Raphael made it in 1509 or 1510, shortly after he'd begun working in Rome. He built a highly successful career there, using both his superlative technical skills and his careful cultivation of powerful patrons. Of course, the most important potential customer for any artist in the early 16th century was the Pope. Both Michelangelo and Raphael worked for this pontiff, Julius II, covering vast areas of the Vatican with frescoes that both celebrated the Christian faith and glorified Julius's personal rule. When Raphael painted this portrait of him in 1511, the Pope was no longer a young man. It seems that he deliberately wanted to be shown in a contemplative, even melancholy mood. Actively engaged in warfare for much of his reign, Julius had recently lost the city of Bologna and had grown a beard as a token of mortification at this defeat. Nevertheless, this painting communicates clearly the idea that this is a man who still has the energy to fight. His downturned mouth is clamped shut with determination. His left hand grips the arm of his chair so tightly that it does not take a great leap of the imagination to picture it forming into a fist. It's intended to be a strong contrast with the more gentlemanly gesture of his other hand, which delicately holds a handkerchief. We are meant to understand that Julius is no brute soldier, but is a man of the cloth who will defend his faith, his people, and his lands to the last. In fact, many people did find Julius II rather terrifying in real life. Anecdotal reports suggest that when this portrait was displayed in a Roman church, visitors were just as frightened as if they were in the presence of the man himself. The rivalries between major artists continued into the next generation of painters. Michelangelo helped Sebastiano del Piombo to develop ideas for this huge painting of the raising of Lazarus, made between 1517 and 1519. His support meant that the young Sebastiano had a fighting chance of competing with Raphael, who was also working on an altarpiece for the same patron, Cardinal Giulio de' Medici. Sebastiano's work was highly praised, but Raphael's painting instantly attracted more attention when the artist died suddenly in 1520, aged just 37. The twisting pose and chiselled muscles of Sebastiano's Lazarus, brought back to life in one of Christ's most dramatic miracles, clearly owes a debt to Michelangelo's art. He looks like Adam from the Sistine Chapel. Sebastiano, though, created this extraordinary composition, which is constructed in ways that unsettle the viewer. Our eyes are swept back in dizzying lines through crowds of astonished onlookers. Fragmented, destabilising compositions are a striking feature in quite a few Italian paintings produced in the early 16th century. This altarpiece by Parmigianino is one such work, seemingly determined to do the opposite of creating the calm serenity of a Raphael or Leonardo. Instead, this takes the edgy, dynamic quality of Michelangelo and exaggerates it even further. Parmigianino has used bizarre poses, abrupt shifts in scale, and acidic colours to create a dreamlike image of St. John the Baptist encouraging us to worship the Virgin and Child. Some of the artists from this next generation are known as Mannerists. The name comes from the Italian word maniera. It describes a consciously artificial, mannered approach to painting that sought to turn high Renaissance naturalism and harmony upside down. Maybe we shouldn't be surprised that artists come up with something so completely different. Perhaps it was an inevitable result of the gradual move towards ever-increasing naturalism and the focus on balance and symmetry that seems so often to be central to later Renaissance painting. What else could follow the different but equally serene paintings of Bellini, Leonardo and Raphael? In an environment of artistic competition and innovation, a reaction that pushed artists in a completely different direction was always likely. In this case, painters moved with conviction away from any conventional notions of idealised beauty, precisely because those perfect forms had been so important to the previous generation and so brilliantly executed by them. From the 1450s to the early 1500s, Italian painters achieved extraordinary results, and their art still fascinates and inspires people today.